Last week, for instance, former Attorney General Eric Holder said he expected the Department of Justice, if it finds sufficient information and proof of intent, that would have to indict Donald Trump and hold him accountable for his attempt to overturn the election. Holder's new book is titled Our Unfinished March: The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of Vote, A History, a Crisis, a Plan. And Eric Holder joins me now. I know that you are loath to do any second guessing or coaching of the man who now occupies the office that you had. And I'm sure when you were in that office, you didn't like to be coached or second guessed yourself. But in an abstract sense, just take me through your understanding of the evidence that's accruing and the decision process that would happen inside a Department of Justice about questions about indictments with respect to people from the president or his inner circle for the kinds of crimes that other people at lower levels along the chain have already been indicted.
Well, you certainly got to draw the connections and show that they were substantively involved and also show that they had the requisite intent. You know, I started my career as a public corruption prosecutor. And after a while, these kinds of matters get a sense of direction, of where they're heading. And I'm at that point now. After the revelations from the January 6th committee, the great job that journalists have done in revealing a whole variety of things, I think you get a sense of the direction of this. And I think that you're going to end up with high-level prosecutions of people close to Donald Trump. I think people at the Justice Department are certainly going to be examined. Certainly people who were involved in the matter actually there on January the 6th and people who directed them. And the question ultimately is what happens to the ex-president. My guess is going to be that they're going to have sufficient substantive proof. They're going to be able to show that you have the requisite intent. And what I've said before, if that is the case, I think he has to be held accountable. And I've said, you know, that's going to be a very divisive thing. And I got a lot of criticism for that. But I think that is a legitimate thing that can be taken into consideration, how divisive that would be. But I also think that has to be balanced against the notion of accountability and really, most importantly, deterrence. We cannot allow what happened on January the 6th to go unpunished because it would invite something like that to happen again in the future. Future people who would consider doing something like this have to be deterred.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, given some of the races we see around the country. But just one more question about this, because, you know, you talked about public corruption, right? So it's not like the Department of Justice has never indicted politicians before. In fact, it happens fairly frequently. I used to practice journalism in Chicago, where it basically happened every week. You've got, you know, a very high-profile prosecution of the district attorney for Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, and her husband, also a politician, right? So this kind of thing happens. There's a kind of human and institutional calculation that happens in that context, even when you're not talking about Donald Trump. Just any place where you're going to bring a high-profile corruption case against an elected official. What is the thinking there in the general sense, even when you're not talking about someone as high-profile as Donald Trump or as possibly divisive, about how you think through a case like that?
I think the president is really fundamentally different from almost any other person, any other office in terms of thinking about what the collateral impacts are. Yeah. I mean, you know, if you're going to think about the vice president, maybe those kinds of considerations enter your mind as well. And I don't mean to say that because he's president, he is beyond reach, or was president, he is beyond reach. Not that at all. But taking into account what the national impact of this case or a potential case would be is certainly something that I think can be legitimately considered by the prosecutor who has to make that ultimate determination. But having said that, and understanding that this is going to divide the nation, I think a non-prosecution would divide the nation as well. Sure. And if we don't have that deterrent impact coming out of the consideration of what happened on January the 6th, we put this republic at risk in the future. Yeah, I mean, I've said this before in the program, but, coups happen in certain places, or attempted self-coups. They happen throughout history. They happen in different countries and different regions. They tend to go one of two ways, right? They're successful, in which case the people seize power and they could do whatever they want to their political enemies. Or they're not successful, and the people that fail, they tend to get arrested or worse, right? It's not that often that you get like an attempt and then it doesn't work out and everyone just kind of says, well,
which is a little bit of what's happened here. And you see it in the crop of Republican candidates. Doug Mastriano, as we've covered on this program, is going to be the nominee in the gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania. You know, he very actively talked about and sought to replace the electors duly elected by the people of Pennsylvania and sub in, Donald Trump electors. And I just wonder what you think. You're someone who's very focused on the integrity and strength of our democracy, and we're going to talk about your book in a second. What it says to you about the fact that Mastriano can occupy this position, 2 years after this happened, or a year after this happened?
Well, I think that says a lot of really disturbing things about the Republican Party. The notion that a person who was actually engaged in what happened on January the 6th, whether he went in the building or not, a person who says that the election was stolen, that there was fraud, when in fact there's no proof at all that that is in fact the case. The person who appears to want to substitute, his candidate, Donald Trump, for the legitimately elected person, Joe Biden, should not be the next governor of Pennsylvania. And my hope would be that that will be a central part of the campaign. Democrats need to focus on this. We need to be the pro-democracy party up and down the ballot. That needs to be talked about for people with regard to people who are running for governor, for senator, for other elected offices. Every Republican needs to be asked, do you think that Joe Biden is the legitimately elected president of the United States, or do you think that the election was stolen from Donald Trump? They need to be forced to answer those questions.
You've got a new book out about voting rights, which find themselves in a very perilous situation right now. And you've been very involved in redistricting, which, of course, is related to that.